The snow had just begun to fall over Moscow, light and quiet, like a hush before something sacred. In the still air of a gray morning, the Kremlin walls stood tall, unmoved by time, but something new was arriving. Not a storm, not a threat, but a man from Africa, whose silence often spoke louder than thunder. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the window of the Burkina Faso presidential aircraft, arms folded behind him, gaze steady. The world below was frozen, unfamiliar, foreign, but inside him, a fire, quiet, disciplined, ancestral, burned with purpose. He had not come to bow. He had come to build. Earlier that week in Ouagadougou, he had walked through his garden at dawn, barefoot, grounding himself before departure. This Moscow visit, though diplomatic, was not just a meeting. It was a message, a statement that African nations would no longer orbit around global powers like satellites. They would walk shoulder to shoulder, sovereign, dignified, unapologetic. The preparations had been meticulous. A military send-off, intelligence briefings, economic files, a carefully selected delegation, each detail a reflection of the new Africa Traoré envisioned, calculated, calm, and completely in control of its destiny. By the time the aircraft touched down on Russian soil, snow had covered the runway edges like a fresh page waiting to be written on. The wheels kissed the tarmac, the engines sighed, and in that moment, cold and ceremonial, the weight of two continents quietly converged. Awaiting him was a formal reception, Russian military officers in thick coats, flags from both nations raised beside the ceremonial platform, and a small cluster of reporters at a safe distance. But something, or rather someone, was missing. As Traoré descended the aircraft stairs, flanked by two of his bodyguards, he carried himself not as a man seeking applause, but as one carrying the memory of Sankara in his spine. His eyes scanned the line of welcoming officers. He had seen enough military rituals in his life to know the rhythm. One salute was not offered. A Russian officer, tall, stern, stiff, stood with his arms at his sides. He did not raise his hand to his brow. He did not nod. He did not salute. At first, the moment passed like a blink, barely a beat in the ceremony. But for those who knew diplomacy, it was deafening. In military terms, a missed salute to a visiting head of state is not just an oversight. It's a message. And in Moscow, messages are rarely sent by mistake. Behind the officer's silence, there was no chaos, no outrage, no reaction. Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't slow his stride. He walked past the man as if he hadn't even seen him. But Commandant Ouattara, his longtime protector, noticed. So did the rest of the Burkina Faso delegation. And far more dangerously, so did the Kremlin's internal observers. Inside the Kremlin compound, where live security footage fed into a central diplomatic intelligence room, the moment was replayed within minutes. Frame 34, a Russian protocol advisor said, "That's the one. Watch again." Later that day, while the Burkinabe delegation was being escorted to their first bilateral briefing, the news had already reached President Vladimir Putin's desk. He was known for his strategic calm, a man who spoke in silences and acted in shadows. But when the advisor leaned in and whispered, "One of our officers failed to salute Captain Traoré on the tarmac," his jaw tensed. Putin asked only one question. "Did he see him?" "Yes, sir. Direct eye contact. No salute." He remained still. Putin did not raise his voice. He simply pressed his finger to the desk and said, "That's an insult. Handle it." Back at the diplomatic quarters, Traoré remained composed. He said nothing of the moment. His team whispered. His aides speculated. But he said nothing. In a private room later that night, Ouattara broke the silence. "Mon capitaine, I know what I saw. The man disrespected you." Traoré replied without turning his head. "Then let his actions speak for him. Ours must speak louder." The next morning, during a scheduled tour of a Russian defense research facility, the protocol team was unexpectedly shuffled. An unfamiliar face greeted the Burkinabe president. "Mr. President," the man said in near-perfect French, You are kindly requested to attend a revised ceremony today, as per direct instruction from the Kremlin. Traoré raised an eyebrow. A revised ceremony? Yes, sir. A formal salute. In your honor. What happened that afternoon would ripple across 2 continents. Under the frozen sky, in front of rolling cameras, a full battalion of Russian ceremonial guards stood in formation at Red Square, a location usually reserved for Russia's most sacred national honors. Traoré's motorcade arrived. The music of the Russian military band began to rise, echoing against the stone walls like history itself. This time, the Russian officer who had refused to salute was not present. Instead, a higher-ranking commander stepped forward with gravity and delivered a crisp, extended salute to President Ibrahim Traoré. Then, a second officer approached and handed him a document. In front of cameras, with reporters watching and flags waving, the Russian commander read aloud, "By executive order from the office of the President of the Russian Federation, we recognize the state visit of Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso as one of strategic importance. In honor of his leadership, composure, and strength, we extend full ceremonial recognition and an apology for any breach of protocol." The crowd did not cheer. This was not a celebration. It was an act of restoration, an acknowledgement that respect is not given because of power, but because of presence. Later that evening, Putin met with Traoré in private. Their conversation was not recorded. No aides were present. Only 2 leaders, 2 minds, 2 men who had long stopped being naive about how the world worked. Putin opened the discussion. "You handled the situation with restraint," he said. Traoré nodded. "Restraint is not weakness. It is strength wearing patience." Putin smirked slightly, then handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was the order of permanent dismissal for the officer who refused to salute. But Traoré barely looked at it. "I am not here to destroy a man's career," he said softly, "only to affirm my country's honor." Putin nodded once, and then silence. The kind of silence only understood by those who carry nations on their backs. News of the Red Square salute spread quickly. Across West Africa, headlines read, "Russia honors Burkina Faso after diplomatic misstep." Traoré earns Moscow's respect without saying a word. In classrooms, soldiers retold the story, not of confrontation, but of a man who stood tall by standing still. In a rural village outside Bobo-Dioulasso, a teacher paused mid-lesson and held up a printed photo of the Red Square salute. "This," she said, "is how we carry ourselves when the world tries to ignore us. We don't beg to be seen. We make it impossible not to be." That night, as the jet engines warmed for the return to Ouagadougou, Traoré looked out once more over Moscow's lights. He didn't speak of what had happened. He didn't need to, because dignity doesn't echo loudly in headlines. It echoes in memory. And in that memory, he had already won. The return flight to Burkina Faso was silent, not in sound, but in mood. The cabin hummed with routine activity, aides reviewing documents, Commandant Ouattara scribbling field notes, the crew offering refreshments. But Traoré remained still, eyes fixed on the dark clouds ahead, unmoving. He wasn't angry. He wasn't proud. He was reflective. Moments like this weren't about victory or loss. They were about memory, the kind passed down through generations. His grandfather used to say, "The loudest man in the room is often the weakest." And today, once again, he had seen the truth of that. The officer who refused to salute had not insulted him. He had insulted the idea that an African man dressed in the cloth of his people, bearing no Western accent or elite family name, could arrive as an equal and be received as one. But the world was changing, and it wasn't asking permission anymore. When the presidential jet descended over the red dust of Ouagadougou, dusk was falling. The sun hung low, golden and fierce, as if blessing the land for having waited patiently. Traoré stepped down from the aircraft to find a quieter reception than before. Not because there was less enthusiasm, but because the people had heard the story. They didn't need fireworks. They had found something more powerful: respect. From students lining the fences to elders who had come just to see him walk, their silence was reverence, a quiet pride. As his boots touched the tarmac, a soldier at attention beside the stairs saluted without hesitation. Traoré returned it. That same evening, in a modest presidential chamber, surrounded by no more than a few key staff and Ouattara, he reviewed the final diplomatic brief from Moscow. It included not only Putin's apology, but also confirmation of a new defense accord, the opening of a Russian trade office in Ouagadougou, and, unexpectedly, an addendum. Upon formal approval, Red Square Ceremonial Protocol will extend full head of state honors to any future delegation from Burkina Faso, beginning with Captain Ibrahim Traoré. This shall include military salute, flag ceremony, and diplomatic guard. He read the line twice, then closed the folder. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, just a little. Ouattara broke the silence. "Captain, the Russians, they moved. For you, for us." Traoré looked up. "No," he replied. "They moved for the truth." In the following days, the incident, and more importantly, the response, flooded African media. On a political panel in Abidjan, a commentator leaned forward and said, "This is a new kind of diplomacy. Traoré didn't demand respect. He stood inside it, and the world adjusted." In Ghana, a university debate class used the event to examine soft power versus hard power. In Mali, a cartoon appeared in a local paper showing a tall, silent Traoré walking past a slouching soldier with the words, "You may ignore my salute, but you will never ignore my presence." But perhaps the most striking impact was not on television or in newspapers or on podiums. It was in the shift, the quiet, almost invisible shift, in how young Africans began to speak about leadership. They no longer praised those who shouted loudest or showed force. They began praising those who didn't flinch. A week later, Traoré visited a school in Koudougou as part of a routine rural development tour. The students didn't ask about roads or trade. One small girl raised her hand and said, "Sir, is it true they didn't salute you in Russia?" There was a pause in the room. Traoré lowered himself to her eye level and said softly, "Yes, but I saluted them anyway, because sometimes respect isn't returned, it's taught." The teacher stood still, hand over heart. The children sat in quiet awe. Meanwhile, in Russia, the dismissed officer, whose name was quietly removed from official rosters, remained unspoken of publicly. The Kremlin did not issue condemnation, but neither did it defend him. Putin, when asked in a closed-door meeting whether further statements should be made, reportedly responded, "No, we've shown enough. The world watched. That is enough." And in a rare symbolic gesture, Putin ordered a commemorative plaque to be placed in a restricted corner of the Red Square Military Protocol Wing, reading, "Let no guest of honor ever be received with less than full recognition. Respect is not requested, it is owed." The moment might have faded, like many diplomatic incidents, but this one didn't, because it wasn't about politics. It was about posture, and the posture of a man who didn't raise his voice, didn't raise his hand, but stood with such presence, the world rose to meet him. That year, when Traoré addressed the African Union Summit, his speech was brief, only a few minutes, but one line was etched into every mind present. Africa's dignity will never be negotiated. It will only be revealed in how we walk, how we speak, and how we wait. The room had stood in applause, not just because of what he said, but because everyone knew it came from a man who had lived it just days earlier, on snow-covered ground thousands of miles from home, and back in Moscow in a quiet diplomatic office rarely visited by the press. A printed photograph sat in a frame on a shelf. A man in uniform, alone, standing in Red Square, receiving a salute that should have been given days earlier. No caption, no fanfare, just a reminder that even in silence, Africa now speaks.